All right, for our final demonstration about using functions, we'll take a look at date and time functions. And these are very commonly used as well, but I do want to stress there are a lot of date time functions, well into the dozens. So I definitely suggest a little bit of extra research, but these are very functional, for lack of a better word, in terms of determining time spans, time frames, values from dates and times, things along those lines. So perhaps one of the most common date or time function is this very first one, to simply select the current date. And you can in fact use the full term current date, but cur date is fine as a synonym. And this quite simply just retrieves the current date. And this can often be used as a filter. Let's compare a certain date to the current date. So we can simply execute this and we just see today's date. Really, that's all it is. But as mentioned, very useful in many cases as criteria. Let's compare all of the sales since today for the last 30 days, something like that. And we'll in fact see some examples of that as well. But that is simply how you retrieve the current date. Now, the next function here, or the next statement, I should say, is selecting the day out of a value that contains a date time data type. So if we were to look at the value, well, actually, let's do that. Let's open up the payment table here. And we can see that the payment date includes the year, the month, the day, and the time. Well, we can extract any one of those values. Okay, so let's go back in, and I'm beginning with simply the day function. So what I'm doing here is extracting the day from that entire value of payment date in that column. And note in the comment here, you can extract the day, the week, or the month, or even the year. And it also works for the time. So you could extract the second, the minute, the hour, things along those lines. So again, let's execute here. And this simply says that of that entire value that was entered, this is the day that it was entered. Okay, so look at this comment. You can replace that with week, month, or year. So let's try that. Instead of day, we'll put in week. And then this will be the numeric week in that year. So the 21st week, 24th week. Change it to month. And of course, we'll see the numeric month. So 5, 5, 6, 6, and so on. Then we can change it to year. And of course, we see the year. And as mentioned, you can execute those statements against the time as well. Second, minute, or hour. Those are all fine. They will all work. So that's why it's not too big a deal in some cases to store the date and the time in the same column. I did mention earlier that I personally prefer to keep the date separate from the time, but if they are stored together, you can use these functions to extract only the values that you need. So it's not critical. The next one is the date add function, and this adds an interval to a date. So in this case, I'm selecting the payment date as due date. Now, I'm just doing this conceptually. The payment date in this case means the payment has been made. I'm calling it due date. Let's just imagine that this is when the payment is due, but it has already been made. But for simplicity's sake, we'll just imagine it was the due date. Then we use the date add function against that column to add an interval of 1 month. And I'm aliasing that as the past due date. So this is when it's late. So let's just take a look at the result. And we can see there is the due date. So May 25th. It is then past due a month later at June 25th. Okay? So again, that is the date add function. Simply specify which column it is acting on and then what kind of interval to add. And that can be anything, any number, and that can be day, month, year, anything along those lines. And that allows you to see, of course, when something is due or past due or whatever you consider it to be. The date diff function is next, and this determines the time span between two dates. So just to illustrate, I'm just passing in two static values. So the difference between December 31st, 2018 and December 31st, 2017 is, of course, 1 year. But we can see this. And the answer does come out in days. Now, I will show you in a moment how you can do a little basic math to convert this into something like a year. But in fact, you could use a combination of functions to produce the same result. But let's look at a more practical example here. In this case, I'm selecting the rental ID and then the date diff of return date and rental date as rented for. And this comes out in days as well. So let's see the result here. So there we see for rental ID number 1, its duration, its rental period, was 2 days. So that uses the return date against the rental date and simply says there's your period. Now, if by chance you get them in the wrong order, it will still work. In fact, let me illustrate that. Let's change this to rental and this one to return. This will still work, but watch the value. Comes out to be negative. Okay, so just reverse the order if that happens. Or maybe you're fine with the negative value. That, of course, is up to you. But I'll just set this back. And in this context, I think it's a little more appropriate to see a positive value. But another common example of that is taking the current date against someone's date of birth to determine their age. And in fact, here is a very similar example to that. They don't have any birth dates in this database, but they do have the date that a customer essentially signed up, if you will. So you can see the create date is listed here for the customer. I can use that against the current date to find out how long this person has been a customer for. So that's the date diff against the current date as customer for from the customer table, and I get my answer. But note, it comes out in days. Here is how you can convert that into years. Just take the entire statement, enclose that in parentheses, and divide it by 365. And you can see now it's in years, but notice it's 12.3616 years. Nest all of that inside a round function with only one decimal place, and now you see a much more meaningful value of 12.4 years. Now, obviously that's all optional, but it does illustrate how you can create some very useful values in terms of date comparisons or date extractions using a combination of functions and mathematical calculation.